The United Nations Security Council has heard there are reasonable grounds to believe war crimes have been committed in Ukraine. The International Criminal Court has been investigating allegations of crimes during the conflict, including the intentional targeting of civilian objects and the transfer of populations, particularly children, from Ukraine. ICC prosecutor Karim Khan told the council they were continuing to gather evidence.
And if I may, Madam President, be quite direct. When I went to Bucha and went behind St. Andrew's Church, the bodies I saw were not fake.
Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov was not at the meeting when these allegations were heard. He arrived 90 minutes late and left shortly after his address. He accused Ukraine and its allies of acting with impunity and trying to impose a narrative of Russian aggression.
This term, impunity, reflects what has been going on in that country since 2014. The national radical forces, open Russophobes and neo-Nazis, came to power then as a result of an armed coup with direct support of Western countries. And right after that, they took the path of lawlessness and totally ignoring main rights and freedoms.
Meanwhile, Russians are fleeing the country en masse after President Putin declared a partial military mobilisation. Video of Russia-Georgia border, the Russia-Georgia border, shows thousands of people attempting to leave the country. It's believed many are leaving to avoid being sent to fight in Ukraine.
At Russia's borders, people brave endlessly long lines in hopes of fleeing the country. And inside the country, outrage and tearful goodbyes as the mobilization of military reservists begins.
While in many ways this may address a manpower issue for Russia, what's not clear is whether or not it could significantly address the command and control, the logistics, the sustainment, and importantly, the morale issues that we've seen Russian forces in Ukraine experience.
Ukraine's president is urging Russians to resist.
55,000 Russian soldiers died in this war in 6 months. Tens of thousands are wounded and maimed. Want more? No? Then protest. Fight back, run away, or surrender to Ukrainian captivity. These are your options for you to survive.
Some say they oppose being drafted to fight in Russia's deadly onslaught in Ukraine.
I don't understand what's there to fight for. Why did we invade Ukraine? I'm against it.
Some say if they're called, they'll go.
If I receive a draft notice, I'll go.
New analysis by the Institute for the Study of War concludes Russia's mobilization is unlikely to dramatically shift the tide of the war, saying it will take weeks or months to bring reservists up to combat readiness, and that many were poorly trained to begin with.
Joining me live for more is Professor Peter Dean, Director of Foreign Policy and Defence at the United States Studies Centre. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon, Professor. 3 times there's been mobilisation in Russia's history, World War I, World War II, and now this partial mobilisation for the Ukraine invasion. I read a very interesting line in an article, and it said, it's clear now that Putin is willing to sacrifice all the men in his country to save his own. What are your thoughts on these latest moves?
Well, mobilisation is clearly showing the desperate state of Russia in the war and how the war is not progressing, of course, how Vladimir Putin would have liked. His campaign strategy at the beginning of the war was a quick and relatively easy victory, completely underestimating the resolve of the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian government. And of course, he managed to do one of the things that the opposite of what he was attempting to do, in terms of he was attempting to divide Europe, and in fact what he's done is unify Europe much more. He's dragged 2 other countries into NATO membership, or on the pathway to NATO membership. So it's really backfiring for him, and tactically the war is not going well and operationally. So this is showing that the scale of the losses that the Russian army has faced in the West, the ferocity of the resistance of the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian military, and it really starts to show the desperate circumstances that Putin finds himself in. And as we've seen, as your media reports were showing just earlier, this is leading to an exodus from the country. It's leading to much more opposition to the war. And it's going to complicate things for the Ukrainian people, the Ukrainian economy. So for every time you mobilise, You take soldiers out of their civilian occupations and put them into the military. That's going to put a handbrake on key components and key areas of the economy in Russia. And of course, the mobilization plans, it's 300,000 people out of a much bigger pool that could be mobilized. But of course, what's already been announced is that they're targeting specific skill sets and capabilities that these individuals have that are of great need by the military, but they're often the same skill sets that are needed by the economy as well. So it's going to create further strain on the Russian economy, a big strain, as we've seen, on the morale and support for the war in Russia writ large. So it goes to show the state that the Russian campaign and war is in. It's still a long way to go. This war is not lost by any means by the Russians, but it shows how desperate they're becoming.
A figure that we have been told is that around 300,000 extra men will be forced to fight in the war. Should we believe these numbers, or should we expect that there would be more conscripted?
Well, this, I think, might be just an initial pass. So what Putin has to do is replace the numbers of people that he's lost in his campaign so far. He's got other security issues now he's going to have to deal with along his border. And it really depends on what his plans, aims and ambitions are for the rest of the war and how he's going to bring this conflict to an end. What we've seen, though, is the parlous state of the Russian military throughout this campaign. It was much hyped as a military in the lead up to the war. There was a lot of grandstanding from Putin and from the Russian senior leadership about the quality of their military. And what we've seen, particularly in crucial areas around logistics and logistical support, in terms of their training, tactics and coordination, has been really found lacking. Now, if the soldiers that were prepared to go into this conflict, that were coming just off the back of military training, has performed as poorly as they have and were as ill-trained as we've seen and demonstrated, then these troops that are being called up, they can't immediately be put into the front line. You're going to have to, many of them may not have served for a number of years in the military. You have to do medical assessments of them. You have to reclassify them. You have to put them into units. You have to provide training for them. You have to find equipment for them. And the equipment and material losses of the Russian army in Ukraine have been significant. So it's a matter not just of mobilizing people, it's how much you can mobilize the economic resources and military resources. And you can't just start churning out high-end military capabilities such as warplanes, tanks and armoured personnel carriers and artillery vehicles very quickly. So
exactly right. And if I could just say, I'm hearing that these reservists, as you say, will need months of training before they're sent into Ukraine. So they still have to go through a grueling winter with the people that they've got, suffering with low morale on the battlefield. They haven't been swapped out for this whole period. Is this a window of opportunity, albeit a short window of opportunity for Ukraine and the West?
Well, the Ukrainians, as we've been seeing around Kharkov and others, have been making great advances. Their offensive operations are going well. But this is a very long-fronted war. It's 2,000 kilometres of front line. Russia is and remains a very large military power, much more capable in terms of its manpower and volume and size than compared to Ukraine. So the Ukrainians have the advantage. They need to push that advantage as far as they can. But of course, the risk that we have here is we know that Russia is a nuclear armed state. We've seen the threats, repeated threats that have happened from Foreign Minister Lavrov and from Putin himself. We've only seen this week the threats that were reiterated about Russian territory and territorial integrity. So there is still a question about how this conflict will end. Of course, for Putin, he's very much wrapped up in his individual leadership and the effect that that will have on his control within Russia. He's certainly been weakened as a result of this. So there's still a very long way to go. But you are correct. There's an opportunity here. It will take a considerable amount of time to put these soldiers into action. Now, of course, the Russians could take some of them if they've only been more recently released from the military, say within the last 6 to 12 months, and put them back into uniform and send them to the front pretty quickly. But as we know, the history of warfare is littered with what happens when you send ill-trained and undertrained people into modern conflict, and the losses that they suffer. So the question is, how is it really tactically going? How long does Russia intend on dragging this war out? But certainly a mobilization call means that he thinks the war is going to go much longer than he thought, and that he's willing to drag the war on potentially for a longer period of time as well.
Professor Dean, I really appreciate your insights. Thanks for joining us on Afternoon Agenda.
My pleasure.